Hello, folks. This is Miss Jennifer Blank here with a lesson about thesis development for your viewing pleasure. Now, before we get started and digging deep into what a thesis statement is and isn't, and take a look at some examples and do some practice, I want to give you a little disclaimer. This presentation is about thesis statements for history and political science essays. Okay, it's not for the AP exam and it's not for other disciplines. I will do a separate video about AP exam guidelines because you can only write that essay in like 40 minutes, right? So you don't have a whole lot of time. It's a whole different process and procedure. But I did promise that I would teach you two different ways. So this is one of those two ways. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about what a thesis is and what a thesis is not, because I found that students have a lot of confusion with what a thesis is and what it isn't, right? So first of all, a thesis is an argument. It is an argument. This implies that there is another opinion about the same topic, okay? That it's possible to have a different opinion. A thesis statement is not a fact, okay? It is an opinion that is supported by fact. So it has to be an opinion that's grounded in some kind of evidence, right? We can't be over here saying, hey, the aliens built the pyramids. Where's your evidence for aliens building the pyramids? It doesn't exist. You can't just pull this idea out of your behind, right? It has to be based on some valid facts and valid evidence. So it's an opinion that is supported by fact and its original idea. Okay, it's not a statement of someone else's conclusion. It's your conclusion. Okay, so remember, key idea here, it's an argument. Okay, the Declaration of Independence was produced in 1776. That's a fact. Can't be a thesis because it is a fact, okay? So you can have an opinion about whether the Declaration of Independence was good or bad, or whether it applied to everyone or it didn't, right? You can have an argument about that, but you can't have a thesis statement as to when it was published, because we know when it was published. Now, what isn't a thesis statement, right? Well, I've given you some examples of that already. But it's not a main idea. It's not a fact. It's not a topic. That's not a thesis statement. You're just stating what you're going to talk about, what the concept of the paper is, but that doesn't tell me what you're arguing, what you're trying to prove, okay? In this essay, I will discuss, prove, show, illustrate. No. That statement right there, that bottom statement, that is not a thesis. Now, whatever comes after it could be a thesis, but that statement by itself does not get you a thesis. And for some reason, a lot of students seem to think, if I just put that down, it's a thesis. It's not. It's not. Okay. So now, what does a thesis actually look like? Well, what are the parts of a thesis? Now, you will see this show up in different ways from different teachers/professors. This is the way I teach it. I try to break it down in like simple 3 basic parts. Okay, so your first part is going to be the basic argument. Okay, the basic argument. This is the basic premise. Okay, this is the direct answer to the question you are trying to answer. Okay, the how is about the process, procedure, or key steps that allow the basic premise of the argument to happen. Okay, and then the why is about motive, intent, and purpose. This explains the reason for something happening, right? Why people believe in a larger idea, what the goal of a nation or of a historical event or person was, okay? You are looking at 3 different parts of this thesis. So let's see what this looks like in action. So basic argument, imperialism had a negative impact on the cultures that were conquered, right? So there are some who argue that imperialism had a positive impact, right? Now, doesn't mean we have to agree with that argument, but it is possible to make that argument. Even if it's a bad one, you can still make it, right? So the argument we have here is that imperialism had a negative impact on the cultures that were conquered. But that's not enough. It doesn't get specific enough. It doesn't detail exactly what we're going to be talking about improving. So we need a how statement to go along with this. Through the belief system of social Darwinism, Europeans justified this exploitation, right? So it had a negative impact through this system of social Darwinism. Okay, that's how the Europeans justified the bad things that they were doing. Why was it bad? Why did it have a negative impact? Or why did the Europeans attempt to justify this? Because it led to the exploitation of native people. That's why it was bad. it led to the exploitation of native people. So imperialism had a negative impact on cultures that were conquered. How did it have this negative impact? Social Darwinism is how. And why? Because it exploited the native people. And here below is your complete thesis statement. Imperialism had a negative impact on the cultures that were conquered because it led to the exploitation of native peoples. Through the belief of social Darwinism, Europeans justified this exploitation. Okay, so here you have a complete thesis statement. Now, the reader knows exactly where your essay is going. You're talking about imperialism, you're talking about the fact that it was negative, and you're telling me how it was negative through social Darwinism, and you're telling me why it exploited native peoples. So this right here is a breakdown of what the essay is going to cover, and it gives you, the author, a roadmap for what you're going to write. You're going to talk about imperialism's negative impact, you're going to talk about social Darwinism, and you're going to talk about the exploitation of native peoples. So how do we create a thesis? A couple of steps you need to think about. So first of all, you need to determine if there is in fact a focus question to answer. In my class, you will always get a focus question. I will always give you a question to use, okay, to follow and to answer. All right, but you need to decide if there is one in different classes. If there isn't, then you might have to come up with your own focus question. That's a subject for another video. So if there's a focus question, you need to directly answer that question. Your basic argument is a direct answer to that question. Not the question you wish was there, not what you think is there, the actual question. So it's really, really important that you understand what your teacher/professor is asking you to do, okay? How, then, are those the steps that made the argument possible? Generally, how statements should start with through or by. Now, you can use any word that you want. You don't have to use those words. But I find that when students are first starting to get the hang of thesis statements, to learn how to make them, I think that some of these cue words are helpful. So you can start your how statements with through or by. And then the why statement is, as we said before, is about the motive, intent, or purpose that came from that argument, right? So usually with a why statement, you'll start with in order to or because. But again, you don't have to use those phrases, but phrases or words, but they when you're just first starting out, they can be helpful in learning the process. So number one, you've got, like I've said, you got to understand the question. You have to understand the question. A big reason why students don't perform well on tests, on essays, particularly standardized tests, is that they don't fully understand what's being asked. And if you don't fully understand the question, you're not going to answer it quite right. You're not going to get a good score. So we really want to make sure you understand the question. So when you're in class with me, for example, you need to stop me. Be like, hey, Miss Blank, yo, I don't understand this question. You need to stop me and ask me so that I can help you understand it and make sure that it's clear. All right? In my class, I love dissent. I love disagreement. I love challenges from students. I enjoy that. Not all people enjoy that, okay? Now, teachers and professors should enjoy that, but not everybody does. So if there is a question that implies a particular direction, go where that question wants you to go. Now is not the time to challenge the question. Okay, you want to get a good score, you want to get a good grade. Okay, go where the question wants you to go. Okay, if the question is implying like history is important, well, it's implying that why is history important? Well, it implies that history is important. So don't be like, history's not important. No, you're not helping yourself. Maybe it's not important, but that now is not the time to engage in that debate. Go where the question wants you to go. Create the basic argument first. Just directly answer the question, and then you can go back and look at your notes, look at the evidence, and decide on the how and why. But the basic argument needs to come first. It doesn't matter what comes next, okay? Either one, how or why can come next. Doesn't matter the order you put that in, but it should come after the basic argument. The basic argument is the most important, and it must come first. Make sure the how and why statements directly relate to the basic argument, okay? They need to all be connected. These are pieces of one puzzle. So you can't be pulling pieces from another puzzle and try to fit it into this other one you're working. No. The pieces have to work together, okay? So the basic argument and the how and why statements all need to be linked. They need to connect to each other. So How do we create a thesis, right? Now, these are for page requirements, and I'll give you more details about this in class with specific assignments. But you want to be sure that the thesis can be proven within the page requirement. Some students pick thesis statements that are too broad or too narrow. If you pick really broad, big statements, you're not going to be able to prove your argument. Maybe at all, but certainly not in a short paper. Romans were the greatest civilization in all of recorded history. There are literally hundreds of different civilizations throughout recorded history that one could argue easily that were better than Rome, or at least as good as Rome, right? So that statement, I would even argue, isn't even provable, right? Because there's so much, a preponderance of evidence, so much evidence that we could pull that would show that that argument is total, like it's no good, you know. But you also want to be careful of statements that are too narrow, because if statements aren't large enough, you won't be able to write enough to meet the page requirement. So for an example, Roman generals were successful because they killed barbarians. If you're looking at doing, I don't know, a 10-page paper, that may be too narrow for you because you can only talk about Roman generals, you can only talk about their successes, and you can only talk about how they killed barbarians. So it leaves out a whole lot of other things that maybe you have to cover in the essay topic you've been given. So you want to be careful about making really grand statements. Words like all throughout history or throughout all of time are not good ways to start an essay. Don't do that. No, those are bad phrases. Bad. You don't want to use those. They're just too broad. And keep your personal opinion out of it. Now, obviously, you know, this is your argument, right? You came up with it, right? You're going to argue it. So it is your personal opinion, but I mean, I mean inherent bias, right? You want to avoid that as much as possible. You're not going to be neutral because you are taking a position, but you do want to be objective. So in history, we're not so much concerned with value judgments, whether something's good or evil. We're concerned with how and why. We want to understand cause and effect. How did something happen? Why did it happen? Hitler, for example, was evil, 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 awful human being. Like, I hesitate to even call him a human being. He was so awful. But I'm not going to make an argument in class over, well, Hitler was evil. No. I want to understand how and why Hitler was able to do what he did. How did he convince an entire nation to follow him? How did this happen, right? Because I want to understand that process as a historian or a political scientist, because if I see something like that happening again in my own time, I want to be like, hey, warning signs. Whoa, you know, we can apply that knowledge to help ourselves in our current context if we understand how things happened in other contexts or in other time periods, right? So you want to avoid bias as much as possible. You want to focus on the evidence, focus on the argument. Now we're going to practice. So what I want you to do, here's your focus question. How and why is history important? Okay, so I want you to pause the video. Pause this video, okay? And then you're going to give me a thesis statement. You're going to give me a thesis statement, and then we're going to take a look at it, okay? And we're going to practice a little bit. So right now, pause this video. If you haven't already done so, pause it. Okay. So here's a possible thesis statement. History is important because it helps us solve problems in our current world by looking at the past. Now, that is a simple, basic argument, but it doesn't really do everything we want it to do. A much more sophisticated, high-level A+ thesis would look like this. History is not only important, it is essential to help citizens understand how the world's problems developed. Examining the causes of those problems can help governments and regular citizens solve or mitigate those problems. Two prime examples of this process are the American and French Revolutions. Now, many of you are just starting out with doing this, so don't panic if you're like, oh my God, I can't do that. That's fine. You're not supposed to be able to do that yet. But I wanted to show you the pretty close to perfect example so that you can see the end result, a possible end result, right? So what this thesis statement does that the first one doesn't is it provides something called nuance. It elevates the answer to the prompt. So the prompt is telling us that history is important. So we know we have to go that direction. We know that's what has to happen. So it says not only is important, it's essential. right? It's essential. So it's taking it up a notch, okay? And then it goes into detail in terms of how we can solve the world's problems, right? We examine the causes, and that can help us deal with those problems, right? And then it gives us examples. So we now know exactly what the essay is going to talk about, right? It's going to talk about how understanding the world, how the world's problems developed is key. It's going to talk about the examination of causes and effects of those problems. And it's going to talk about the American and French Revolution. It gives us an exact direction of where to go, okay? Now, I want to come back to this simple one because I want to show you how we can make this one better, kick it up a notch, right? So history is important because it helps us solve problems in our current world by looking at the past. This statement is a bit vague. We could be talking about any problems. Where in our current world? What about the past, right? It's really like you could really go anywhere with this thesis, and that is going to result in some struggle when we go to write the eventual essay because we're not going to be totally sure where we should go. So one way we could make this a little more specific is by, if we're looking at how history helps us solve problems, we could look at climate change, right? We could look at climate change. So that is focusing the essay. Now we know we're going to talk about climate change. We're not going to talk about all the world's problems, right? We're going to talk about climate change, right? By looking at past government reforms, right? So not just at the past, but at government reforms. Now we're talking about climate change. We're talking about government responses, right? And a way to make this even better would be by assessing past government reforms, right? So now we have a much more focused thesis statement. Now we're not just going to look at any past government reforms. We're going to not just look at them, we're going to assess them. We're going to evaluate them. We're going to determine their success, right? So I hope you see how just a few words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words, 5 extra words takes this thesis to thesis, right? 5 words. Right? So the important part is to start the process, get something down on paper, and then when we're in class, then we can all help each other. In small groups, you can ask me, and we can help each other get from this one up here to this one over here. Just 5 little words, guys, 5 words. We can do that. Anyway, I hope you learned what you needed to. I look forward to working with you on this in class, and I will see you in the next video.